conference. I, Vincent Alexander, Chairman of Idpada-G, will be the presenter. I'm accompanied by two members of the Coordinating Council of Idpada-G, Mr. Royston Peters and Dr. Norman Dikekwi. Today, we are pleased to take this opportunity to announce on behalf of the United Nations and on our own behalf, the declaration of a second decade for the people of African descent. This declaration will run from January of this year and 10 years hence. The theme for this second decade is no different from the theme of the first decade: recognition, justice, and a development. That there is a second decade immediately poses a question as to why. In that regard, it would be useful to note what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights had to say, and I quote, "To secure the full rights and freedoms of people of African descent, states and all of us must effectively confront the legacies of enslavement and colonialism, dismantle systemic racism, and deliver." It's important for us to pause and to note the elements of what he said. On one hand, he talks about the securing of rights and freedoms. On the other hand, he talks about states, meaning the various countries and their governments and their peoples, and all of us should be confronting the legacies of enslavement and colonialism, dismantle systemic racism, and deliver parity justice. The second decade is therefore being called on the assumption that these ills have persisted, and therefore there's need for more time for them to be addressed and for there to be operate at a universal level. The question therefore arises, what's the application of this to Guyana? We in Guyana are still victims of the remnants of enslavement, colonization, and I dare say have found ourselves in the state of neo-colonialism, all of which embraced elements that are discriminatory in relation to the people of African descent in particular. And that alone gives reason why the second decade is very much applicable and relevant to the Guyana situation. But not only do we have remnants of those systems which have been referred to, but we also are actively suffering from infringements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For example, we suffer from infringements in relation to freedom and discrimination. We see this in the realm of the public service, the security forces, the award of contracts, and evolving our life, Article 3 of that declaration. There are continuing problems of extrajudicial killings, adding victims to those who over the years have so suffered. We've also seen that Article 5, which speaks about freedom from torture, continues to be breached here in Guyana. And similarly, Article 6, the right to recognition before the law. And Article 7, the right to equality before the law. Article 8, the right to remedies, and the right to a fair trial. All of these, there are actions that are taken which are quite contrary to what those rights provide for. We have instances of the weaponizing and denials of justice through political manipulation of the administration of justice. The need for reform in our justice system. And one can easily quote the example of Idpada-G itself, which on one hand has been denied on the other hand, having brought this matter to the court, the decision seems to be languishing since this matter was brought in 2023 after the suspension of the subvention in 2022. But that has to be taken also in the context of the manner in which the judiciary itself is being treated, the continued denial of the appointment of the Chancellor and Chief Justice, and the whole question of equitable access to justice. It's one thing to speak about justice, it's another thing to speak about equitable access to justice. And the fact that our system of justice has retained a lot of anachronistic legal procedures that impede the adjudication of the substantive issues, thus denying justice where it is evidently being observed in the breach. One can look at the plethora of cases, even constitutional cases, which have been determined on procedural grounds rather than the substantive matters being addressed. These are all remnants of the old system we refer to, remnants of the system under enslavement, under colonialism, and evidence of a new colonial state, which we are subjected to. The issue of the right to property under Article 17. We have glaring instances of the violation of those rights, with good examples in terms of what's happened on the Mocha corridor, the Mocha-Arcadia corridor, where people of African descent have been bulldozed and removed from lands under the pretext that those lands were to be used for the construction of a road, which has since been constructed, has evidently not been constructed on those lands, although government officials continue to say to the public with a bare face that the road is traversing those lands. The physical evidence is there to show that they are prepared to spew lies in the face of acts of discrimination. And so we come also to Article 19, issues of the right to freedom and opinion of expression. And we know what threats have been meted out to social influencers and to others, only for freedom of expression, to the extent that there are those who have been brought before the courts under the so-called Cybercrime Act. A continuing problem can be identified with Article 25, the right to adequate standard of living, a right which continues to be infringed and entrenched if only one looks at the recently read budget. That is certainly not too poor and therefore not providing for adequate standard of living of the ordinary man. And the right to education as well, not only from the standpoint of access to education, but from the standpoint of the quality of education which is being meted out. And so one can easily understand and see the application of the second decade to the people of African descent in Guyana. Not only because of the breach of those rights, but because of the attitude of the government. We have a government that contends, in fact, that there are no peculiar, specific, historic problems that are affecting the people of African descent, and that the people of African descent have access, like everyone else, to all that's available, and therefore one cannot identify a program, specific program, that the government has articulated for the people of African descent, notwithstanding the call by the United Nations for such a program and the evidence in Guyana that there is need for such a program. A program which should not only speak to the economic issues, but should speak to what the Declaration has repeated. That is the issue of the existence of institutional and legal barriers to people being able to realize their freedom and to realize their very being. We have lots of old institutional arrangements, be it in the police force, which was formed when it was formed as a force, not as a service, be it in the health sector, which does not pay sufficient attention to the historic issues, dietary issues, and other issues that affect the people of African descent. And so we can go across the various institutions in this country. And as we go across those institutions, we can see that they have not been geared to address the issues affecting the people of African descent, although the government at the same time would contend that there are no such issues and that there's no need for special attention, even as they give handouts to some of the people of African descent to be engaged in programs that in no way addresses what the decade calls for. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them giving funds to these organizations, but you can't pretend that that is what addresses recognition, justice, and development that is called for by the decade. Institutional arrangements and legal arrangements have got to be addressed. These things have got to be transformative if we are indeed to be addressing the issues that confront the people. So in that context, we see that for the first decade, Idpada-G sought to, on one hand, work with the people of African descent for their empowerment, and on the other hand, advocate change at the level of the state, because much of the institutional and legal changes have got to be brought about by the state. And we have seen the stern resistance of the state to accepting the need for and putting in place programs and projects for the realization. But Idpada-G continued to work with and for the people of African descent in that regard, notwithstanding conscious activity by the state to undermine not only the work of Idpada-G, but to divide and rule among the people of African descent. In that regard, Idpada-G will continue to do its work which has to be done both at the local level and at the international level. At the local level, to continue to advocate. At the local level, as far as possible, to continue to be involved in programs and projects to enhance the well-being of the people of African descent, and to continue its advocacy for the necessary changes in institutional arrangements and legal arrangements that will give the people of African descent an opportunity to benefit from the patrimony of this country. Bearing in mind that there is the need for a equitable approach to such programs and projects, because having been denied over centuries, having been affected over centuries, even if there are changes to provide for equalization, people of African descent will not be able to benefit in the way in which the decade envisages, declaration envisages, they should benefit from the work of the decade in the attempt to bring about recognition, justice, and development for the people of African descent. Idpada-G stays alive. And in that regard, Idpada-G has been doing work on a way forward, given the second decade. That work has been done through consultations, will continue to be done through consultations, and that will culminate with Idpada-G itself at the level of its General Assembly, given its acquiescence to the way forward. So in the not too distant future, Idpada-G will in fact be going public on the question of the way forward, given that there's a second decade, given that there's need for a second decade, given that we have to confront the problems in Guyana in relation to the status of the people of African descent, and therefore we'll continue our work in pursuit of the goals of the decade, both at the local and at the international level. Thank you very much for lending your ears to that presentation. We will now open the floor to you for questions in relation to the issues which we have brought to your attention. Essentially, the second decade, the people of African descent as declared by the United Nations, and the attendant issues, the need for the decade, what has not been done in Guyana, what ought to be done in Guyana, and the role that Idpada-G continues to play in trying to realize the goals of recognition, justice, and development for the people of African descent. Thank you, and your questions are now welcome. Do you have any takers in terms of questions?
Hi, good afternoon. Svetlana from News Source. Mr. Alexander, given the second decade that is given, would Idpada-G make another attempt? I know that in the past, in an effort to resolve the many issues that would have confronted the organization in the past, would have reached out to the president and a meeting. Well, the president would have committed to having a meeting with Idpada-G. I don't think that meeting came off. But as a last resort, would you then again write the president to maybe have another have a meeting to see if he would be willing to sit down with the organization and to have the issues resolved? Are you optimistic that that option would work?
First of all, let me say that if one looks at the declaration for the second decade, it does call upon the state to be an active actor in that regard, I think the state has an obligation to have a plan for the second decade that is dedicated to the people of African descent, rather than continue to suggest that there's no need for such a plan. Idpada-G, as an advocate in that context, will reach out to each and every stakeholder that can impact the work of the second decade, and the government is no exception.
Good morning, Adam Harris. Sir, there was this forum at the United Nations attended by a lot of people, you, Darren Wade, Miss Olive Sampson, all of that, and you put forward your case, to which you said the government responded with 100 and something page document that didn't address the issue. What has been the reaction of the United Nations to the various problems you put before them? And can the UN do anything other than what it's doing at this time?
Thank you very much for that question. Let me indicate that the review of the situation on human rights in Guyana, the periodic review, will take place in February of this year at the United Nations at its Geneva Human Rights Office. And we will be active participants in that review. And what will occur at that review essentially will be for us to update the forum on the action which has been taken in terms of recommendations that came out of the last periodic review. And the standard practices that coming out of this review, UN will once again be making recommendations in terms of actions to be taken by Guyana to address human rights issues. So that's where we're at in terms of the continued engagement with the UN. We are up now for yet another review and for another slate of recommendations in terms of what action should be taken. And in fact, for the government to be asked to respond to the present state, given what comes out of the periodic review.
That being the case then, sir, you say the court, the matter of the subvention is languishing in the court. You're getting no supplementary funding from the government. You're using whatever resources you can garner from anywhere to conduct your program. But I want to know, isn't there anything immediate that could be done to help Idpada-G actually perform better, especially at this time, sir?
What I've noted in the second declaration that's more emphatic than in the first is the UN calling upon agencies, including itself, to make resources available for the work of the decade.
And the next question then, I suppose, since no one else wants to ask at this time, you are obviously relying on volunteer efforts. What is the recruitment like? What is the quantum of volunteers working with Idpada-G? And when you're done with all of that, could you give us a preview of what we could expect from Idpada-G during this year?
All right, in terms of volunteers, our entire coordinating committee is a body of volunteers. The way in which Idpada-G is constituted by a number of African Guyanese organizations, and much of the work is in fact done at the level of the organizations. And so in those organizations, the membership of those organizations are in some regards a part of the body of people who are doing the work. For example, presently we are administering a project funded project, and we have got 35 organizations which are beneficiaries and are admin and part of that ongoing project. That apart, we do have individuals who are volunteers in various ways, both in terms of skills and in terms of resources. And these individuals are both local and overseas. On the project which I refer to, we have been able to retain some paid staff because the project funding provides for that.
And the preview for this year, sir.
As I said, we are moving towards concluding our way forward document. In that regard, it may be a bit premature for me to pronounce finitely on the way forward. We will be having an assembly in the not too distant future, where that document will be finalized with our membership. I think we will then have the right to go public in terms of our way forward. Context of the decade, advocacy on one hand, empowerment of our people and our organizations on the other hand, and continued engagement with the national community as well.
Last question from me. The government had, through JAGDIO, had indicated that it was going to approach these organizations directly with sums of money, since he claimed that Idpada-G wasn't forwarding the money to these people. Have these groups accepted the money, and are they continuing to be receiving money from the government, sir?
Let me respond by that question, firstly to say that the Vice President continues to misrepresent the mandate and the mission of Idpada-G. Idpada-G was never intended to be a donor agency or a grant agency. They have been giving grants to organizations. We have not encouraged those organizations not to take the grants. In fact, we've said to them, take the grants, because the grants reflect what is intended to be undertaken by the state in terms of transformation of our institutional and legal arrangements. And therefore, by touting grants as a response to the decade, what in fact the Vice President is doing is blatantly denying the government's obligation to and involvement in the work that is required of the state. That is exactly what that grant giving does. It's a kind of a mirage, pretending that they're in fact addressing the issues of the decade, when in fact those grants do not address the issues of the decade. They do address Guyanese organizations which are entitled the grants for their regular programs and activities. The decade is a peculiar moment that requires specific kinds of actions, and the government has refused to engage in those actions and has actually gone out there suggesting that there's no need for any such action because there are no peculiar circumstances affecting the people of African descent. The United Nations has continued to contend that across the globe, there are special circumstances affecting the people of African descent. And we have been able to exemplify by the fact that there are such circumstances. The way in which our lands are treated clearly show such circumstances. The way in which local officials are excluded from being involved in decision-making certainly are examples of such circumstances. The operation of the police force, which operates as a force rather than a service, is again an example of such circumstances. And so there's tremendous duplicity in terms of the government. On one hand, giving support to reparations, which are essentially a call for compensation that's external, and on the other hand, denying the right for the issues of people of African descent to be addressed internally, given the peculiarities of those problems.
Afternoon. This end for credible sources. Am I being heard? Wanted to ask a couple of questions quickly.
You are being heard.
Thank you very much. Very good afternoon again to the entire panel, fellow members of the media. I want to pick up quickly on Mr. Adam Harris's question. I know that a couple of months ago, a number of organizations claiming to represent segments of the African Guyanese community had propped up. I was wondering if Idpada-G had been keeping abreast with the work of those new organizations and had any comments in terms of their own engagements with the government, number one. Number two, I was wondering whether from the presentations you've made to international bodies like the United Nations, whether you had any initial responses on or off the record on the information that would have been provided to them. And thirdly, I may have missed it since I joined a little bit late, whether there was a, what is the work plan for Idpada-G for 2025? Thank you very much.
First of all, I think your terminology of organizations that popped up is quite adequate and quite correct. We are aware that there are some organizations that are government-sponsored organizations. The mobilization for those organizations was actually done by political activists of the government. And those organizations are not necessarily bottom-up African Guyanese organizations. We are not in the business of condemning the right of freedom of association, but we do recognize that there are organizations which have been government-sponsored, and therefore there's an attempt by the government to project that they are dealing with the African Guyanese community, when in fact, they are themselves creating fronts in that regard. Indeed, you may not have heard my response in relation to the plan, but I did indicate that Idpada-G is presently finalizing its way forward, and in the not too distant future, we'll have a forum like this where that way forward is brought to the Guyanese people. We are fortunate this time around, we're doing it at the commencement of the decade. In the first decade, we didn't start until 3 years in. There was a second question, which could you repeat the second question? So which I haven't answered. I didn't answer your.
Forgive me, someone else may wish to jump in. And I'll come to it in a second. I'm trying to remember.
He talked about your way forward, which I attempted to ask, and he also talked about the
Thank you,
well, these
Adam. I was asking about the initial reactions to organizations international based on the information you would have put forward and what's happening locally. Thanks very much, Adam.
All right. Let me say that at the international level, there are two aspects. There are the people, individuals, who have been responsive, and therefore we are receiving assistance from those individuals in our pursuit of our programs. And those are largely financial assistance and to some extent programmatic and technical assistance. In terms of the United Nations, the other forum where we've been active, basically much of what they have done is to approach the government for accountability in terms of its actions coming out of recommendations made at those fora for actions in relation to the people of African descent. And the fact that there is a second decade is also a response by the United Nations to the need for governments and the society, civil society and the society at large to continue to be responsive where they have been, and to be responsive where they have not been to the needs of the people of African descent.
So what is the relationship between Idpada-G and these government-sponsored groups as they stand at the moment?
There is no relationship. I don't think that they are desirous of a relationship because of the purpose for which they have been established.
Have any of them sought membership in
No.
Idpada-G?
No.
No.
To our knowledge, there are about 4 or 5 of them. There
And
was
well, sorry,
we contact with
What?
them at the address. They could not be located at the address that they had given in their publication.
that being the case then, sir, would the government be fair to say that it is assisting African-based organizations and organizations linked to Idpada-G? Because initially the grant was intended for Idpada-G, and the vice president said he's going to approach these organizations independently. Could you conclude that that's the case?
May I repeat? Prior to the decade, it was the custom of governments in Guyana, on occasions such as emancipation, to give some funding to the people of African descent organizations. So that's not something new. What is new is that the government has, in addition to that, sought to give grants to organizations. Indeed, those grants are of some assistance to the organizations, but I made the point earlier that the mandate of the decade has a lot to do with transformation of the environment in which the people of African descent exist. Transformation of our institutions. I talked about the police force, I talked about the health system, I talked about the education system. Those grants are not addressing the core issues that the decade seeks to address. And so those grants are merely a supplement to what was previously given and what any Guyanese organization can get for the normal operations, but are not addressing the issues of the decade. And therefore those grants, if they are said to be, in fact, a replacement of what was coming to Idpada-G, is really a deceitful act on behalf of the government. Are there any other questions?
I don't know, I've been opening my mouth a lot. You were dubbed a political organization by the government. Has that impression changed?
At which level? I will answer that. It's a registered non-governmental organization. Idpada-G does not subscribe to any particular political party, and the membership of Idpada-G has the freedom of association as a matter of right with any political party, and to have their own political persuasion. So Idpada-G in that context is not in any way a political organization. If there are no other questions, may I thank you, the press, for your attendance and for your questions. And we do look forward to continued engagement with you. And we hope that those of you who have been listening on Facebook as we stream on the fact that the UN has declared another decade. Two, that this decade is very, very fortunate given the continued situation in Guyana in relation to the people of African descent. And three, that Idpada-G is still on course as an advocate, as a source of empowerment. The objectives of the decade. Thank you.